called Atwater and Benedict. And their aim was to demonstrate that human beings are just machines. They didn't, when they did this experiment, think that they might find anything else. They knew the truth already. They just wanted to prove it, to convince anyone who might have doubts. They got the wrong answer to start with, so they changed the correction factors for the food that was involved until they got the right answer. And when they came up with the right answer, lots of people in science wanted to believe it. It was accepted without question. People said this is the last nail in the coffin of vitalism and so on. And it became a fact. Well, it wasn't challenged till the 1970s when an American nutritionist called Paul Webb reran their experiments. He found huge discrepancies. He found that people who were overweight and doing very little exercise somehow were losing 25% of their energy. It was just vanishing. People who weren't eating and who were doing a lot of exercise were gaining something like 25% more energy than they should have had. And he called it X, there's missing energy. And then he looked back at Atwater and Benedict's results from 1900, and he found what they'd done. They too had found discrepancies like this, but they'd made sure they had just as many people who were above as below the right answer. So they averaged out to give exactly the right answer. Now, what is this extra form of energy? Could there be another form of energy? Well, that's what lots of people in Europe used to believe in vital energies. It's what prana in the Indian system, it's what qi in the Chinese system. There's lots of people who say there's other kinds of energy we draw on over and above the energy of food. This is normally dismissed as utterly inconceivable because of the law of conservation of energy. But it may be quite conceivable. It may be there really are forms of energy going on. There are people, after all, who claim to live for months, even years, without eating. How is that possible? Are they all total frauds? There have been lots of Christian saints, Hindu saints, there are people in China, there are breatharians. Some of them may be frauds, but those who've been investigated seriously in recent years have not been frauds. Something utterly weird is going on, yet it's totally inconceivable from the conventional point of view that they could be drawing on other sources of energy, because there are no other sources of energy. But there might be. I think this is a completely open question. If I were a nutritionist, I'd make it a priority to study breatharians and people who claim to live without food, because that would be fantastically interesting to find out. Well, of course, not everyone can live without food. I was debating this with Ray Tallis at a medical conference recently. And he did say, well, he said, if you're right, he said, there are people on hunger strike in prison, he said, ought not to die, or maybe they just die of fright. Well, I mean, it was a good point. Not everyone can live without food, but some people seem to be able to do for long periods. Very interesting, but totally off the scientific map. You can't look at this at the moment. But in a new, more open science, you would, and I think it would be a very interesting investigation. I want to turn now to the dogma that the laws of nature are fixed. This is a hangover from 17th century science. In the 17th century, it was a revival of Greek materialism and atomism, as I've just said, but also of Pythagoreanism and Platonism. The founding fathers of modern science, Kepler, Galileo, Newton, Descartes, Robert Boyle, were all Platonists. They thought that God had the laws of nature as mathematical equations in his mind, and that the role of science was to find out the absolute truth about nature by reading the mind of this mathematical God. That's why science got such huge prestige right from the outset, especially with Newton's laws. Because in the 17th century, there were religious wars all over Europe. Protestants and Catholics were killing each other in the 30 Years' War. Here in England, we had the Civil War, which had a large religious component to it. And during that period, the founders of science said they discovered a third way to know God, a much more absolute knowledge of God, much more true, and less subject to all these doctrinal disputes. And science achieved this incredible prestige, and scientists became the new priesthood of a different world, of a new world order. And a lot of Enlightenment rationalism is based on that, the idea that scientists were discovering the absolute truth. They were the new priesthood, it was superior to religion. Science and reason would lead humanity forward to the conquest of nature and an entirely new life. And that became the dominant ideology of the whole educated world since the late 18th century. It's now the official philosophy of every government in the world. They're all into economic development through science and technology. This was the idea of fixed laws of nature was built into science from the outset. The problem is that when in 1966 the Big Bang theory became orthodox in cosmology, instead of an eternal universe, or one that just went on and on forever, having been created by God in the first place, there was a beginning of the universe, a scientific theory of the beginning of the universe with the Big Bang. The universe began very small and very hot, less than the size of the head of a pin, about 14 billion years ago. It's been growing, cooling, and expanding ever since, and as it does so, new forms and structures appear within it. It's much more like a gigantic developing organism than like a machine. So what about the laws of nature? Were they all there at the moment of the Big Bang, like a kind of cosmic Napoleonic code? Or could they have evolved like everything else? Well, as soon as you think about it, you realize that the concept of law of nature is deeply anthropocentric. Only humans have laws. In fact, only civilized humans. Tribes have customs. And this projects this human idea of law onto the whole of nature, and then assumes that they're eternal. Human laws actually do evolve. It's not actually a very good metaphor at all. I think a much more appropriate metaphor for an evolutionary universe is habits of nature. This was suggested around 1900 by the American philosopher C.S. Peirce. And he did a brilliant job, I think, in suggesting that the universe evolved long before it became scientifically orthodox and that it would have habits. I think that it's much more reasonable to think of the habits of nature evolving along with nature than fixed laws at the beginning. As my friend Terence McKenna used to say, modern science is based on the principle, give us one free miracle and we'll explain the rest. And the one free miracle is the appearance of all the matter and energy and all the laws that govern it from nothing in a single instant. So I think these habits of nature develop and evolve along with nature. I think evolution is an interplay of creativity and habit. Now, my own theory of how the habits work is morphic resonance. Morphic resonance is the idea that similar things influence subsequent similar things across space and time. And nature is made up of self-organizing patterns of activity. Atoms, molecules, crystals, cells, tissues, organs, organisms, societies of organisms, like flocks of birds. There are, by the way, really spectacular ones, if you haven't seen it, just before sunset here in Brighton over the pier. It's one of the best murmurations of starlings that you can see in England, and I haven't seen them this winter, but I'm pretty sure they'll be here. Yes, they're absolutely spectacular. So I think all of these are self-organizing patterns organized by morphic fields. Morphic means shape or form. And that the patterns, the vibratory patterns of activity that make up those fields of activity resonate with similar patterns in the past across space and time. That's the idea of morphic resonance. What it leads to is the habits of nature. It means each kind of thing, each kind of crystal, each species of animal or plant tunes in to the collective memory of its species and in turn contributes to it, that the habits of nature are inherited through morphic resonance. The instincts of an animal are like the habits of the species inherited by morphic resonance. Now, this idea makes a lot of testable predictions. It predicts that if you make a new kind of chemical that's never existed before, crystals, when you form the crystals, those crystal forms won't have existed before. That lattice structure, the arrangement of molecules or atoms, will be new in nature for the first time in the history of the universe, assuming they haven't formed on other planets. Well, that means that the first time there won't be a habit. You have to wait for a new pattern to appear in nature. Often takes months or years before the first crystals form of a new compound. The next time you crystallize it, anywhere in the world, there'll be morphic resonance from the first crystals that make it a bit easier to form. The third time from the first and second crystals, the fourth time from the first, second, and third crystals. So it'll cumulatively become easier for new crystals to form. A new habit will be growing up in nature. Actually, new crystals do form more easily all over the world as time goes on. It's very well known to chemists. They usually assume that it's just because of transferring fragments of previous crystals which act as seeds or nuclei for crystallization processes. They assume it's because of the physical transfer of tiny fragments of previous crystals from lab to lab. The usual story is they're transferred on the beards of migrant chemists. And when there haven't been any migrant chemists, it's assumed that they're wafted around the world as invisible dust particles in the air. So I'm saying that morphic resonance would make this happen even if you exclude migrating chemists and filter out dust particles from the air. It should still happen. The theory also predicts that melting points should increase of new compounds, and indeed the evidence shows they do, surprisingly. I discussed this in my main book on the basic theory of morphic resonance in relation to biology and chemistry, my book A New Science of Life, recently published in a new edition, updated with all the latest evidence. This leads to a completely different interpretation of heredity as well. The conventional theory, the dogma 6 I mentioned earlier, is that all inheritance is material, except for cultural inheritance, like babies learning language. All inheritance is material, primarily in the genes. Now, most people assume that everything is genetically programmed. It's all in the genes. I've always said, for at least since I came up with the morphic resonance theory in the 1980s, that genes are grossly overrated. Now, no one would pay any attention to that in the 80s because most biologists thought that soon the whole of life would be figured out in terms of genes. Through molecular biology and genes, we'd know everything. When the Human Genome Project was started in the late 1980s, we were promised that this would unlock the key of life. Suddenly, human nature would be laid bare in the genetic code that determines everything about us. And because of this enormous enthusiasm for genomics, billions of dollars were invested publicly and privately in genomics and biotechnology. And the assumption was it would explain everything in terms of the genes. The whole thing has come unraveled in a most extraordinary way, especially in the last 3 years. The Human Genome Project has been a dismal failure. Hundreds of billions of dollars have been lost out of biotechnology investments. A Harvard Business School report recently said it's one of the biggest money-losing schemes ever devised in the history of human finance. That most of these companies have come to nothing at all. And there's now a problem in the very heart of biology, this rocking biology, called the missing heritability problem. Now, this emerged exactly as a result of the Human Genome Project. The human genome was finally unveiled in the year 2000 amidst a great deal of hype. Since then, tens of thousands of genomes have been sequenced from lots of people. And a recent project, the last few years, there's been something called the Genome-Wide association studies, in which the genomes of 30,000 different people have been compared. And you know all the features of those people, what diseases they have, what they look like, what height they are, and so on. You look at the genomes to try and work out which genes are responsible for which features of the person. And they started with simple, straightforward things like height. We know what people's height is. It's easy to measure with a tape measure. And it's been known for years that tall parents tend to have tall children, short parents tend to have short children. That you can predict the height of the children on the basis of the parents' height, making allowances for changes in diet and so on, with an accuracy of about 80%. In technical language, that means height is about 80% heritable. So they looked for the genes for height. They found about 50 genes involved in height. They then made mathematical models to weight some genes more than others, and they did their best shot at predicting height on the basis of genes. And then they took random people from the 30,000, predicted their height on the basis of genes, and then someone looked up what the actual height really was to see how good the prediction was. The prediction turned out to be accurate with an accuracy of 5%. Now, just with a tape measure and without spending hundreds of billions of dollars, you can get 80%, as people have done for years. And the gap between the 5% determined by genes and the 80% that's actually known to be heritable is called the missing heritability problem. 75% turns out not to be explained by the genes. And this is true of a wide range of characteristics, including many diseases. So personal genomics transforming healthcare, what we were told about years ago, simply hasn't come to pass, and nor will it. Some scientists think that the genome project's been a disastrous failure, and to spend more on it would be throwing good money after bad. It's true believers say that, oh, there must be lots of millions of, or thousands of smaller modifier genes that we haven't yet discovered, so give us billions of pounds more and we'll figure it all out in another 10 or 20 years. Increasingly, scientists don't think this will happen. I have a genome wager with Professor Lewis Wolpert about the predictive power of the genome. This came out in 2009. We agreed on a wager that would end in 20 years. The wager is, by May the 1st, 2029, it will be possible to predict all the details of a multicellular organism given the genome of the fertilized egg. Professor Wolpert bets that will happen. I bet it won't. At stake is a case of fine port. We took advice from our advisors on what would go up in value over 20 years rather than down, like money. And the general consensus was port would be ideal. For those of you into fine port, it's the Quinto de Vesuvio 2005. We paid half each, and it's in the vaults of the Wine Society, awaiting May the 1st, 2029. Luckily, Wolpert and I both have sons who are scientists, so if we die before then, which we may well, we're going to have sons who will be able to enjoy this port. Most scientists think that I'm going to win the wager. In fact, last time I saw Professor Lewis Wolpert at a meeting of the Royal Society, he said to me, Rupert, I've come to the conclusion you're going to win. Even he is now giving up hope for the total predictive power of the genome. It's not surprising, really, because we know what genes do. They code for the sequence of amino acids in proteins. They don't code for the shape of your nose or the shape of your arms or your legs. They just enable you to make the right muscle and nerve cell proteins and skin proteins and eye.